walked through Abolition of Man,
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis. You really got to talking about story and involving yourself in a story, and maybe you could just speak to how that also helps shapes our desires and our hearts.
Yeah. You know, it's pretty common, and I think helpful to think of our lives as a story. You know, maybe a series of short stories, but maybe there's this overarching story. But one of the things about living our life is that we can't see the beginning, the middle, and the end all at once, right? So we're like somewhere in the middle chapters right now. You and I, you know, some of your listeners might be earlier on in their stories.
Are you calling me middle-aged
or
right
later
now?
on, but you know, we're both. Well, we don't have to say on film just how old we are, but you know,
We're not over the hill, but we're on top of the hill.
top of the hill.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the positive way to spin that.
That's right. Okay, so we don't quite see the end. We can hope for a certain kind of end, and we want to be with God in heaven, of course. We want to live out the rest of our lives, however short that may be, virtuously, loving others and so on, and die a good death. But we don't know for sure exactly what fortune or providence will bring us, right? And so there's a sense, especially in very difficult times, you know, you can wonder, you know, is this all really headed toward a happy ending? And one of the things that really good stories can do for us, and by really good story here, my benchmark is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, which is my favorite novel. And one of the wonderful things about reading a story like that is, although there's a lot of sadness, you know, you get to the happy ending, not a completely perfect, everything's rosy ending, but the main conflict has been resolved in favor of the good. The good has decisively won. And Tolkien talks about this, you know, the good winning at the end of the day somewhat unexpectedly. He calls this a eucatastrophe, the catastrophe that is good, where somehow out of the wreck and confusion of life, some great good can come. And by holding on to good stories like The Lord of the Rings, we can trust, or at least sustain a hope that in our own lives, even if there is some sort of catastrophe, minor or major, that catastrophe really can be catastrophic. So yeah, I think that stories are a good way for us to sustain that hope, that as difficult as obedience might be, or as illness or bereavement might be, that all is not lost.
That's good. It seems like you know, when we read a story, when we enter into a story, we are participating in it in some way. I like the way that you said, but you get to see that whole story. Of course, all great stories also kind of point to the great story, right?
Yeah.
That we are a part of, and help us remind us of the story that we're a part of, that does end in eucatastrophe, right? I mean, Jesus on the cross kind of deal. When it looks like everything is wrong, it's all in chaos, nothing can go right, we killed God.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, and before we killed God put us in the garden and wanted us to have this stewardship over the world, and everything was nice, and we wrecked it all. And then God came up with this brilliant solution. He was going to unite himself with our nature and come and be with us, and then we killed him. So it's just like the story gets even worse. You know, it starts off really bad, and then it gets even worse. But then there's Easter Sunday.
yes.
Right? And so
Yes.
in the midst of that darkness, where it looks like the devil has won, like the forces of evil have decisively won.
Yeah.
And then Sunday morning comes. And you know, and going back to Tolkien, because I love him so much. But he calls the gospel story the greatest myth. Like, it's the ultimate story, the one of which every other story is kind of like a shadow or an echo.
Right. Well, I know that I have found for my own desires the more and the more diverse ways that I see that single story, that does something to my heart and to my
Yeah.
desires, and adjusts my motivations even for my behaviors that I know are good.
Yeah.
And so I love this, and I appreciated you coming and talking with our students. One, I mean, what is just the obedience and trust that the obedience as an act of worship forms us into the kind of being that we were designed to be,
Yeah.
and then being reminded of who we are in this great story by participating in great stories
Yeah.
is an extremely practical way to help shape our desires as well. This is great and gives me lots to think about. Anything else that you think would be helpful for us to consider or think about, or even resources you'd point us to in just this idea of shaping our desires?
Yeah. I think, I'll mention the essay by Tolkien that where he talks about eucatastrophe and the gospel as the greatest story. It's an essay called On Fairy Stories. So I highly recommend that for more on that sort of theme. And then, on the C.S. Lewis side, you mentioned Abolition of Man, which is a great book to go to for just getting a sense of the way in which desire and moral duty ought to work together. He doesn't, in that book, he doesn't have a lot to say about the love of God or the worship of God. He's more focused strictly on our emotions and on morality there. But it's still helpful for understanding, ideally, the moral life should be a life of joy and not drudgery.
Right.
And then, he has, in his little book called The Problem of Pain, one of the ways that Lewis tries to help us make sense out of pain is God trying to transform our desires. And there's this little line there that maybe I'll just kind of throw out there and either close with it or we can keep going.
That sounds good.
But he says the goal of the Christian life should be to replicate in our emotions the basic situation that exists just by the fact that we're creatures. So in other words, God has made you, God is the first cause of everything that exists, and that sort of hierarchy just is part of the very nature of what we are. But our emotional lives and our intellectual lives ought to conform to that same basic creaturely structure. Ultimately, that is ordered to joy, and it's ordered to deep knowledge of God. But it takes a lot of work, both on our part and primarily on God's part, to get us to that place where our thinking and our feeling are fully aligned with God. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, the way that God aligns them, at the end, is for joy and for knowledge, not for misery or confusion.
Yeah. So good. Hey, thank you for going on a ride with me and Roscoe.
Yeah, this was fun.
Enlightening us. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Beautiful car, beautiful scenery.
Oh, Roscoe appreciates that.
Yeah.
He likes the compliments for sure.
You're doing well. I thought, Roscoe, I do have to say that as we were going up one of those hills, I started doubting you a little bit, but you pulled through.
He can do it. He's like the little engine that could.
And also at one of those left turns trip, I started doubting you a little bit.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
But you put on the brakes and we made it.
Well, I do like to drive race cars sometimes. That was good.